And it will be about 20 minutes long, and then we'll have a couple more minutes to eat, and then we'll get right into the talk.
Thanks. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Governor.
Yeah, all right.
Have a great day.
You too. Yeah.
You know, people already have a hard time before Election Day making sure that they get full information, nonpartisan information on the issues, prepare themselves to vote. So on voting day, the last thing you want is for them to feel like they need to overcome all these challenges to submit their ballot, to make their voice heard.
Historically, voting systems have been designed around the regulatory requirements, what the law says about how to deliver elections, but no one had really stopped and looked at voting systems, the actual equipment, the ballot design, and everything around that from the perspective of the voter. What does the voter think? So VSAP flipped that on its edge and said, let's start with that.
For 35 years, voters in LA County used the Votomatic punch card system. In 2003, the stylus was replaced with felt-tip pens, and InkaVote was how we elected presidents and school boards and decided over 450 propositions. But with every election cycle, it became clear that voting technology had fallen out of step with voters' needs.
You know, in every election, you know something's going to happen, you just don't know what.
Charles Stewart is the co-director of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project and provided his expertise to Los Angeles County during the earliest stages of the VSAP initiative.
You have to be agile in this environment because there's new ways either to screw up or there's new ways for people to cast doubt on the outcome.
Research has shown that people care a great deal about elections. They are passionate about candidates and issues on the ballot. But at each step of the process, they are asking themselves, is it worth the effort? Deciding who and what to vote for is just the first hurdle. How and where to vote adds even more obstacles.
Where this started was a desire to create a voting experience, so something more than just technology and systems, but a voting experience that has the ability to measure up to the significance of voting, the fact that in the act of voting that we're doing something very individualized, but it has a cumulative impact.
You know, at the end of the day, we're all voters and we all face the same challenges: time, education, access. We all just want to be able to know where we can vote, have it be a place where we feel safe and we can get to relatively quick. And when we walk out, we feel like we trusted the process and we know that our vote has been cast.
The process to design a new voting system began with the Open Design Search. It cast a wide net and collected input from a broad range of experts, designers, and the general public.
So where do we stand today? This is our latest prototype. This is a more sophisticated prototype. It's not fully functional, but it is something that we can take out to voters, walk them through what that voting experience would look like.
He started by really getting to know the voters, the various interest groups, the people who had, ideas about what Los Angeles needed for voting, and then use that to develop a set of principles. I mean, he built this slowly and carefully in a way that so few projects have the luxury of doing, and so few project leaders have the patience to do.
Thanks for coming to vote today. There is a touch screen in front of you and a paper tray to the right. Your ballot is now loading.
The interesting thing about the project, of course, I don't live inside Dean's head, but I know at the beginning Dean was very interested in the user experience.
We literally had people in our first forum when we started this project who I would say were pretty active critics of our operation and critics of the systems that were previously used for voting. We wanted them at the table.
IDEO is a global design company based in the Silicon Valley. It was hired as a design partner to work with the registrar's office and the stakeholders' advisory committees to design the concept, look, and feel of this voting system, a modular system that could adapt over time.
Dean is taking a major risk. And the risk isn't like that he's doing something wild and dangerous. The risk is that he's doing something radical to improve a fundamental part of our democratic system. But no one else wants to do that, and especially a system as large as Los Angeles County.
Excuse me. Do you have ink a vote?
If you think about designing for equity in voting, so you think about starting with the people who have been most underserved by the process.
Designing for the voter experience or the customer experience is actually bringing somebody in who has those needs and having them interact with the equipment and realizing that it doesn't matter if it's the right height, if it doesn't feel comfortable for that person, or if it doesn't give them the sense of privacy or the independence that it gives any other voters.
Our number one goal is a private and independent voting experience.
Say, like when it says the thing about customize, I couldn't reach that selection.
As the voting rights advocate for Disability Rights California, Gabe Taylor brought a needed perspective to the VSAP project. He remembers an early brainstorming session at IDEO.
You know, people would be chiming in with the idea of like, you know, I would want greater sensitivity on the touch screen. I would want larger keys on the keypad. I would want, and as people would suggest different ideas, someone from the IDEO team would just be popping up Post-it notes. And it was the first time that I ever really felt like this was a project where everybody had a say in this design.
You not only have to think just about what the machine looks like, you have to think about whether it's going to fit in a warehouse. You're going to have to think about, you know, the tubs that you put the ballots in, that you have a chain of custody process to ensure that you can account for all this paper that's floating around the system. So just the logistics that voters almost never see.
The challenge of holding a successful election in LA County is colossal.
I think a lot of people don't realize the size and scope of Los Angeles County. So we have more registered voters in this single county than 42 of the states have statewide.
Yeah, Dean always likes to remind us, you know, if we were a state, we'd be the 7th largest state and all that. So, you know, it's a lot of people.
With a lot of different needs. And the ballot marking device, or BMD, would have to be adaptable, accessible, and secure.
So this was the looks like prototype, almost finished. And then this is the final design that we ultimately have as the design validation unit. So this actually matches the specifications that we will put into the documentation when we actually go out to find somebody to manufacture the devices.
A manufacturing contract was awarded to Smartmatic for 31,000 VSAP BMDs. At the same time, the voting environment was undergoing some dramatic changes, spurred in part by the landmark Voters' Choice Act, which the California legislature passed in 2016.
What was great about it is it really enabled us to take our vision and the work that we put together on VSAP and accelerate that into the development phase of our system, because then we had the regulatory framework that would allow us to deliver on that research and design that we had been working on for so long.
The election is just around the corner, and Los Angeles County has a new way for voters to make their voices heard. New Los Angeles County vote centers are located throughout the county. Cast your ballot near your home, work, or favorite park.
VSAP was designed to work within the Voters' Choice Act, which is something we've never seen before. Being able to design an entire administration towards how voting was going to be.
Hey, from the Carson Community Center, check this out. This is what the new voting machine is going to look like for 2020. They're having mock elections throughout the city and county of Los Angeles to give you a chance to learn how to do it. Now voting will come to you. You won't have to go to voting. It's a great system. It's going to revolutionize the way people have a chance to cast their ballot. I love being a part of this.
Casting their ballots for things like favorite LA selfie spot and favorite LA sports team, thousands participated in a mock election, setting the stage for a pilot in November 2019.
This technology is better, so it was a good experience.
My voting experience was awesome. I checked my ballot and there were no mistakes, and I printed it out, cast my vote.
Yes, I did check my ballot.
I did check my ballot before.
The system allowed me to check my ballot. I would make sure that I had everything correct.
New voting machines have to pass a gauntlet of tests mandated by the California Secretary of State before they are certified. Following the November municipal election, there were some hardware and software issues and security concerns that needed to be addressed.
And sure, there were issues and there were questions. And of course, the reason you do a pilot is to be a good dress rehearsal and get all those issues out. But no one left saying, what have they been doing for all those years? They left saying, wow, this is easy.
Still, with the March 2020 primary election right around the corner, the big question was, will Angelenos know what to do and where to go?
The great thing was that there were a lot of people that came out to vote. Voter turnout is always important, but we need to ensure that our systems are capable of efficiently processing those voters and making them feel like they have a great experience, but that they can trust that their vote will count and be counted.
There was a major problem on Tuesday, Super Tuesday, with long lines and waits at polling stations throughout Los Angeles County, the largest voting jurisdiction in the nation.
Obviously not the rollout that we had hoped for, but I think it's also important to point out that the majority of the issues that we dealt with today on the technical end related to the check-in process.
Dean Logan, the LA County Registrar, you can almost see that he feels the weight of 4.3 million registered voters in LA County on his shoulders.
The whole narrative that VSAP was a voting system for the future was overshadowed in the days that followed by calls for a review into what went wrong.
Anytime you take a project like this, something that hasn't been done before, you run the risk of putting yourself out there, and you have to be willing to take those bumps and to risk failure in order to finally get to success. And I think when I look back at March 2020, I think there were a number of things that we learned in that process, a number of things that we could have done better. But the fundamental idea of VSAP, the equipment, the model, it was sound.
What people are left with is an experience, their memory of experiences of the last thing that happens. So if they don't get through that polling place smoothly, what they remember was this election didn't go well.
Logan promised his office would be heads down to correct the problems from the primary. But no one could have predicted the months of tumult that would follow.
Who could have imagined that a decade-long project and then the experience that we went through in March would lead to even more unexpected challenges?
A once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Streets nationwide filled with demonstrators. Record-shattering weather and climate disasters. Disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories flooding our media feeds.
The 2020 election was challenged by people who wanted to make really outrageous, unfounded criticisms against the system. In that process, the fact-based part of the election infrastructure held.
Each new challenge added a layer of complexity that forced the county's election officials to pivot and adapt seemingly overnight.
They've also come up with this safe presidential election plan, which includes placing machines at least 6 feet apart and sanitizing the touch screens after each use.
Logan acknowledges there is work to be done to convince voters that the system is secure, especially with polls showing many fear their ballot won't be counted accurately.
This should make casting a ballot in person a lot easier, allowing voters more leeway in deciding when to vote. On top of that, any registered voter can cast a ballot at any vote center.
The fact that you were able to see such great venues across the city, and just the fact that you can now think back and think, whoa, I saw the Dodgers there and I voted there. I think it brought an extra kind of cherry on top to the whole process that was so great and, is the fabric of Los Angeles.
I think what's great about that and what I'm particularly proud about for our organization is that the VSAT model, the agility that was built into the VSAT model, was to recognize that we don't always know what we're going to face, and we need to be able to deliver despite those challenges.
Thank you very much.
Stick your time.
Oh, yeah, please. That's fun, right? That's right. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks for volunteering.
Absolutely.
There's a joke in the election community, which is that one day we'll run a perfect election and no one will notice. I think we went from very rocky primaries across the country to really beautifully run elections.
There was this very cool moment because I was able to vote on something that I helped bring about. I went to vote and my daughter was sitting behind me, and my wife said, you know, Papa helped design this. And that was this really cool moment.
I'm an avid voter, and I am one of those people that enjoys the voting experience. I vote with my mom. My mom speaks Spanish, votes on the Spanish language ballot. I didn't have to help her for the first time, and she walked away like pretty much over the moon. The fact that she was able to do it on her own. So that was great. It made this whole process worth it.
It's not my place or Donald Trump's place to declare who's won this election. That's the decision of the American people.
In the weeks and months that followed, baseless claims of voting fraud and direct attacks on our democratic institutions forced officials to defend the integrity of the election, a task made easier in part due to the successful implementation of the VSAT model.
The integrity of the election rests on, as I like to say, good election laws expertly implemented. The placement of polling places was carefully thought out. Things like what data get reported to the public was carefully thought out. I do think LA County is a model for innovation in voting technology, absolutely.
Teamwork makes the dream work, right? And so you guys all pulled together and you were able to pull off an amazing event. You know, you're the light on the hill for everyone across the nation to look at how well we pulled off our election.
The real lesson of this project is that this work is never done. We have to continue to pay attention, to listen, and to break down the barriers that hold people back from voting, and address the security concerns and address the accessibility concerns. We made big steps in doing that with the VSAT project, but that work is ongoing and will continue going forward.
Thank you all for your attention for that video. We have a few more minutes before the talk begins, so feel free to continue to eat and chat with people at your table about the film we just watched. And we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you. Good evening and welcome back to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Jacob Smagula, and I am one of your 4 Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Imagine trying to walk a tightrope in heavy wind. Every step you take, there's a force pulling you in a different direction. This is what it's like to run an election in the United States today. Navigating intense polarization, dealing with disinformation, and public doubt, and the design challenges of system resiliency and transparency, election administrators face enormous obstacles to ensure that every voter's voice is heard and that every vote is counted fairly. In Los Angeles County, this challenge is multiplied by the sheer size and diversity of the voter base. Nearly 5.8 million registered voters, representing countless backgrounds, languages, and communities, all expecting a smooth and trustworthy voting experience. In the shadow of events like Gore v. Bush in 2000, where the very mechanics of voting became a flashpoint for national debate, the stakes for election administrators have never been higher. Politicians, voters, and entire communities have come to question not only the results of the election, but the processes that underpin them. Trust in elections is no longer a given. It's something that must be earned and protected at every step of the way. And earning that trust, especially in a place like LA County, requires the commitment to designing an election experience from the ground up, built on voter feedback and public involvement like we watched in the film. It's not just about ensuring a smooth election day. It's about creating a system that reflects the needs and concerns of voters in real time, while also being resilient to the growing forces of doubt and disruption. Dean Logan, our speaker today, knows these challenges intimately. As the Registrar-Recorder and County Clerk of LA County, he has not only navigated these turbulent waters, but he has also led the way in rethinking how elections can and should be run. Under his leadership, LA County developed and implemented a publicly owned voting system, one designed specifically around feedback and needs of the voters themselves. But make no mistake, election administration is more than just a technical task. It is an act of public service. Ensuring that every citizen has the opportunity to participate in democracy is one of the most essential and sacred duties of our government. Election workers are at the front line of that effort, not just on election day, but every day leading up to them, balancing the demands of accessibility, efficiency, and security, all under extreme scrutiny with no margin for error. Outside of his role as Registrar-Recorder and County Clerk for LA County, Dean Logan serves as the current president of the County Recorders Association of California, is on the board of the directors for the National Election Center, and is a former president of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. Additionally, he is vice president of the United States on the board for the American Conference of Subnational Electoral Organizations for Electoral Transparency. And if that wasn't already enough work, he also sits on the advisory boards for the Electoral Psychology Observatory at the London School of Economics, the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, Auburn University's Graduate Certificate in Election Administration, and the University of California, Riverside's Design Thinking Executive Program. At California State University in Northridge, he teaches courses on organizational leadership, public sector management, intergovernmental relations, and strategic management at their Masters of Public Administration program. This talk tonight is co-sponsored by the Kravis Lab for Civic Leadership and the Rose Institute for State and Local Government. At this time, we ask you to please silence your cell phones and direct your attention to the speaker. As always, video and audio recordings are strictly prohibited. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dean Logan.
Good evening. Thank you, Jacob, for that very warm introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I have to say that it warms my heart just that you would have an interest in coming out. And I can tell you that tomorrow, and you'll learn if you haven't already that I'm a geek. I'm a public sector geek and an election geek. Tomorrow is 46 days before the election. And there is a lot going on. We are on a very much a crescendo into the peak part of the election cycle. And I feel very fortunate to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to have a conversation with you already just at the table and at the reception. This has been a good reminder. It's a good boost to my inspiration of the importance of the work that we do and what's at stake in 46 days here in our community, but in this country. And it really inspires me to know that the level of interest and the level of curiosity and fascination with the process that's in this room. And so I just wanted to start with that. Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you for the work. I talked to many of you outside about the work that you're doing around civic engagement and encouraging people to participate in the election and educating our electorate. It's important work, and it's an important part of the process. The mechanics of running elections is important too, but it doesn't happen in isolation. We talked earlier with some folks when I first got here about you can have a great voting system and you can make it inviting, but if people do not feel intrinsically that their vote makes a difference and that it has impact, then all of that investment that you saw and the work that you saw in that video is devalued. So it's important that we collectively are coming together and encouraging each other to participate in the election, to fight back against cynicism, fight back against disinformation and misinformation, and to reclaim the power of our vote in the country. So what I hope to do tonight is spend a little bit of time in the presentation giving you some background, kind of giving you a look under the hood of what's involved in running elections in Los Angeles County, tell you a little bit about Los Angeles County as a jurisdiction and how that played into the initiative, the Voting Solutions for All People initiative that you saw in the video, and then talk a little bit about the mechanics of just simply the logistics that go into an election. So what's happening over the course of the next 46 days and maybe what's happening the 46 days after the election, which is still a critical part of the component. And then talk a little bit, kind of transition into talking about what is the landscape around elections administration in this country and in this community right now. What are the new challenges that we face, and how are we preparing to address those issues and preparing to address those things that we may not even know about yet that could happen over the course of the next 46 days. And then wrap up by just sharing with you kind of some personal insights for me as somebody who has studied leadership and change management about what are the takeaways for me of the initiative that we undertook in designing and developing a publicly owned voting system and implementing a new voting model here in Los Angeles County. So a little bit about my department. I'm an appointed official. I work for the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles County. I was appointed to this position in 2008. So I've been in LA County for about 18 years now. Originally come from the state of Washington, where I did similar work. My department is somewhat unique. I suppose any department head is going to tell you that, but I like to believe that my department is unique within LA County government, in that I think when they organized LA County government, they took everything that didn't fit somewhere else, and they added a hyphen and a slash and called it the Registrar-Recorder County Clerk. Because if you go to neighboring jurisdictions, my department might actually be 3 separate departments, but in LA County, they merged them together to create this department of Registrar-Recorder County Clerk. So we have 3 main kind of umbrella functions that I'm responsible for in the county. Mainly tonight, we're going to talk about my role as the Registrar of Voters, and in that capacity, my department administers all local, state, and federal elections in Los Angeles County, and I'll talk about Los Angeles County as a jurisdiction. But I also, just for your reference, we're also the recorder of deeds, so all real estate property transactions, the chain of title and the historical perspective of all property in LA County is maintained in perpetuity in our office. We actually maintain the 4th largest repository of public records in the United States. Only the Pentagon, the National Archives, and the Library of Congress have more public records than we have in our little obscure building in Norwalk, California. And then as the county clerk, we're responsible for vital records. So the history of everyone who lives in LA County is really preserved in our office. So birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, property ownership, and of course, the right to vote. So our philosophy is that we are the department that is responsible for your significance as a resident of Los Angeles County and having a record of that preserved so that your history as an individual will always be there. And it's an awesome task. It's a high honor to be in the position, and every day is an adventure. I tell people all the time that if you're somebody who likes to wake up every morning to a predictable life and career, being a department head in LA County is probably not for you. But if you're somebody who likes to wake up every morning and say, hit me with whatever's going to come, and we're gonna go through it together, then it can be a pretty exciting and fun place to be. So a little bit about Los Angeles County. You heard some joking from my friend Charles Stewart at MIT. because nationally, I like to share these statistics because I think a lot of people just don't realize the enormity of Los Angeles County. So we are large, diverse, and complex in a variety of different ways. We're geographically large. We cover over 4,100 square miles. People think about Los Angeles as this urban area, Hollywood, and Beverly Hills and all that, and that's certainly a part of the culture and the geography of who we are as LA County. But we also have very rural areas, farming areas and agricultural areas in the northern part of the county. So geographically diverse, diverse in terms of ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, economic diversity, linguistic diversity, all of those things that make up the fabric of Los Angeles County. Total population, and this is a little bit out of date, but close to 10 million people in Los Angeles County. Of those, about 6.6 million of those who are eligible to be registered to vote. And today we're at about 5.7 or approaching 5.7 million registered voters. And as you heard in the video, that is more voters in this single county than 42 of the states in the country have statewide. So while we are regulated and operate as a function of local government, we're larger than most state governments. And that creates some interesting challenges and opportunities. And I also believe that that creates an obligation to also lead and to leverage that diversity and complexity to do new things and set new models for how we deliver public services. This just gives you a little perspective. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but this, again, is just a demonstration of the estimates of race and ethnicity in Los Angeles County, and again, just drives home the fact that we are a richly diverse community. And when it comes to voting, that means from a regulatory standpoint, we are required under the National Voter or the Federal Voting Rights Act and California State Voting Rights Act to provide our election materials and our voting information in 18 languages in addition to English. So on top of everything else, we also are preparing our materials in a way that can be presented to voters in their language of choice. And that is one place, and you'll hear me say this, probably say this again, but one example that was part of this sort of brainstorming when we first undertook this project of Voting Solutions for All People is to start to look at things like that from a perspective differently than traditionally counties and government used to. A lot of times in this country, things like the compliance with the Voting Rights Act or compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act with regard to voting, unfortunately default to sort of just checking the box. So the law requires us to have one accessible piece of voting equipment in each voting location and requires us to have voting materials available in a particular language. So we just check the box and say we did that. But for many years, for decades, we never stopped to look at how effective were we at doing that. Were people actually using those translated materials? And if you were a person with a disability, did you know about the accessible voting equipment and how to use it? And what we learned is no. In fact, oftentimes that piece of accessible voting equipment sat in a corner and the election workers crossed their fingers and hoped nobody would ask to use it because it was a more complex part of the process. And in that sense, we were isolating voters who needed those services, right? So part of the idea of the Voting Solutions for All People was to go beyond checking the box of regulatory compliance and look at what is the intent and the purpose of that law and how can we make the voting experience customizable and relatable and accessible to all of our voters. So that really was sort of the philosophy around the voter-centered approach. Now, there's a lot in that video, and there's a lot that I can tell you tonight that kind of is that warm, fuzzy feeling about this process. We did something that I think is pretty phenomenal. I'm very proud of that. But I think it's also important for you to know that we were sort of, on one hand, we wanted to do that because it was the right thing to do. On the other hand, we were sort of forced into that situation. Because back in 2008, after that presidential election, we realized that our voting equipment and our voting model in Los Angeles County was at the end of its life cycle, and in some cases was very much on life support. And that if we didn't take some action to reimagine or replace our voting technology and our voting equipment, we would find ourselves unable to conduct elections in Los Angeles County, which of course would be unacceptable, being the largest election jurisdiction in the country. But on the other hand, when we did a market assessment of how could we do the traditional government process of putting out a request for proposals for a new system, we quickly discovered that there wasn't a market solution that was available that would meet the needs of this county. Because again, we're larger than most local governments. The commercial voting systems market at that time was very limited and was very controversial because coming out of I'm taking you back in time, but coming out of the 2000 presidential election and the Bush v. Gore decision, there was controversy over the punch card voting systems, and very quickly there was federal funding provided and jurisdictions across the country moved to paperless voting systems, only to find in 2008 and 2012 that those systems had the same level of controversy and concern and distrust that the punch card system did. Fortunately, because of our size and complexity, we had not made that change yet. So we kind of accepted the brutal facts of our reality and said, okay, let's take advantage of this as a large jurisdiction, and let's re-envision what the voting system could look like in Los Angeles County. And let's not look at this as a technology or system process, but let's look at it as an experience process. What will the voters, the future voters of Los Angeles County, expect from their voting experience, both in terms of equipment, place, location, but also just simply the environment, and what are the things about the mechanics of voting that could leave our voters with the confidence that their vote made a difference. So in the fall of 2009, we embarked on this unprecedented effort to design, engineer, and manufacture the first publicly owned voting system in the United States. Part of the controversy of the limited market was concern for the corporate influence on the voting systems that were used in the country. So we were very intentional in saying we wanted to create something that would be publicly owned, that belonged to the voters of Los Angeles County. And so we started that process, and we adopted a human-centered design model. And we spent a considerable time, a number of years, actually just going out into the community, holding focus groups, observing people in their interactions with government activities or in their day-to-day activities, and trying to interpret how could that lead us to a voting experience and a voting model that would be responsive to the way voters live their day-to-day lives. So you can see, I mean, we literally started with drawings and foam core designs. And we were very emphatic that we didn't want to do this in a vacuum. We wanted the public to be involved in the design process. So we also learned very quickly that one of the best things you can do in a human-centered design project is plan for the extreme cases, plan for the edge cases. So we in particular talked to not only to voters who regularly vote and asked them what did they like about their voting experience, what made them have confidence that their vote was being cast as they intended, but we also reached out to people who were registered but who were infrequent voters and said, what is it about the process of voting that keeps you from participating in elections? We talked to voters with disabilities and asked them, what are the challenges, what are the barriers you face to voting in the county? We talked to voters whose first language was other than English and said, what would be a better way to present you with voting materials in a language that would be meaningful and accessible to you? And we put all that together into the design that resulted in the voting model that you're seeing today. And here are the components of that voting model. And this has been in place. We rolled this out in 2020. And these are the components. It includes a modern tally system. That is the independent tally system that actually counts your votes in LA County. It's a standalone system. It's publicly owned. It runs on commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software that belongs to the county. We created what's called an interactive sample ballot, which allows voters one of the things we learned in our focus groups is we often got asked questions about why can't we use our cell phones to vote? Why can't we use our personal devices to vote? We learned very quickly that young people, surprisingly, and people are surprised when I say this, young people were the most skeptical about using phones and devices for voting because you all know the capability of those devices. It's actually people in my generation who say, well, I'm doing everything else on my phone, why can't I vote on my phone? Because we are not as well equipped with with all of the trickery that you can do with your phone. But we didn't just reject that idea off the cuff. What we said is there is a place in the voting process where you can use your device. So today in LA County, you can get your sample ballot on your personal device, your personal computer, or your phone or your tablet. You can go in and fill that ballot out in advance and actually create a QR code and take that into the voting location with you, scan it in, and it will pre-populate your choices on the ballot. It's not your official ballot. You still can change your mind. You can modify the ballot. But once you're satisfied with those choices, you print out your ballot and you cast your ballot. So it provides for an expedited voting experience. Vernon and I were talking earlier about how long the ballot is in California and Los Angeles County, and how even those of us who are very engaged in the process find ourselves sometimes surprised in the act of voting. It's like, well, I didn't know about that contest, or I didn't know about that measure. The interactive sample ballot allows you to, at your own time, when you get to that point, it saves your work and you can go out, have your conversations, do your research, and come back and complete that. The ballot marking device, which is really the hallmark of the new model, is a device that allows you, if you're voting in person, to mark your choices using a touchscreen device that lets you review your choices. But then at the end, when you're satisfied with those choices, it actually prints out a paper tangible ballot that can be used for audit and retained for recounts or anything of that nature. And then once you're satisfied with that, your ballot goes into a ballot box and comes back to us for central tally. Those are augmented by an electronic poll book. Electronic poll books are the way that we check voters in, and they allow us to open all of our voting locations. So a voter in Los Angeles County can go to any voting location in the county. You're no longer limited to a particular assigned voting location on a random Tuesday between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. And then, of course, kind of underscored in all this is making sure that we had a viable vote-by-mail process. And vote-by-mail is sort of the manner of which most voters in the county vote, but we also were very clear that we did not want to limit it to one mode of voting. We wanted voters to be able to choose to vote at the time, place, and manner that is most meaningful for them. So as I say, today we offer voting looks very different than it did prior to this. It used to be that you were assigned to a single polling place near your home, and you voted on a random Tuesday between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. I don't know if you know it, why we voted on Tuesdays, why Election Day is on Tuesday in this country. It actually dates back to our agricultural times. Tuesdays were the days that farmers brought their crops into town to sell, so they were in town, and therefore they were available to vote, and everybody knew them, and so that's how they verified who could vote. Now, it's been a very long time since people were bringing their crops to town on Tuesday, yet we still traditionally think of voting on Tuesday, and that's what it dates back to. But in LA County and in several counties in California, we adopted this new model through the Voters' Choice Act. We now mail everybody a vote-by-mail ballot, and in fact, 2 weeks from today, we'll be mailing the ballots to all voters in LA County for this election. But we open up our in-person vote centers 10 days before Election Day, so that's 2 weekends before Election Day. Those vote centers are open to all registered voters in Los Angeles County, so you can go to vote where it's most convenient for you. If you're going to a farmer's market on the weekend to do some shopping, you can stop and vote at a vote center nearby there. If you're taking your kids to daycare on your way to work, the idea of our voting model was to meet people where they're at, to have voting be visible and available to people when and where they were ready to cast their vote. So near their place of work, near their social activities, near their gym, any of those activities that when you're ready to cast a vote within that 10-day voting period, our goal is to have somewhere in your path of travel, somewhere where you can stop and cast your ballot. That's augmented by our vote by mail program, which also allows you a variety of options. If you vote by mail, you can return your ballot. You can vote and return your ballot through the U.S. Postal Service. There's no postage required. You can drop it at one of our official drop boxes. We have about 420 of these drop boxes that are located throughout the county, and we pick up the ballots from those on a daily basis. Or you can drop your vote by mail ballot off at one of those vote centers during that 10-day voting period too. So in reality, today, there really is no excuse not to vote in LA County. And that, again, was intentional. It was intentional to say, we're going to make sure that when our voters, our electors, feel the intrinsic value of voting, that they won't have any barriers in their way of voting. Because we know from history that if you are motivated to vote, but then you face barriers in being able to cast your ballot, then you're likely to lose that motivation, and we're not going to have you show up and participate in the process. Conversely, we know if you have a good voting experience the first time you vote, you're much more likely to become a lifelong voter and to participate in the elections going forward. So that's sort of the philosophy that led to where we are today, sort of getting out of the check the box mentality, meeting voters where they're at, and making sure that the time, place, and manner of voting was customizable to the way people live their day-to-day lives. But of course, in a jurisdiction the size of LA County, the mechanics and the logistics of doing that are enormous. So here's the part where I'm going to get a little bit under the hood to show you what's happening behind the scenes. On the vote by mail side, so I mentioned that we'll be mailing ballots 2 weeks from today. We have 5.7 million registered voters. That means that that's 5.7 million pieces of mail that have to be ready to go into the mail. And of course, not everybody gets the same ballot, right? Because the ballot includes your very localized contest. So we do all of the preparation for that. Most ballots in this election will be 3 pages, two-sided. It's a very long ballot. Includes 10 statewide ballot measures and includes contests from President of the United States down to your local water commissioner and school board members. So there is a lot for voters to take in on that. That is one of the reasons, by the way, in our research that voters indicated they like the vote by mail process because they like that ability to have that time to go through the entirety of their ballot. Military and overseas citizens' ballots actually go in the mail tomorrow. Those are citizens who are residents and registered voters of Los Angeles County, but are living overseas, either serving in our armed forces or living abroad. In addition to that, we offer remote accessible vote by mail. So if you are a person with a disability who cannot navigate the physical paper ballot, there is a way from your home computer or from your accessible devices for you to access that ballot, mark it, print it out, and mail it back to us. And as I mentioned, there's multiple ways to return your ballots. Once those ballots come back to us, the vote by mail ballots, they're subject to signature verification. So every one of those ballots, before they can be counted, we are verifying that the signature on the outer envelope of that matches the signature of the voter that the ballot was issued to. So again, in this election, we expect probably 2.5+ million ballots to be returned to us. All of those will go through a signature verification process. Then they go through an extraction process, an extraction meaning that we separate the actual voted ballot from that signature envelope, and that maintains the anonymity of the voter, so that ensures you a secret ballot. We physically review that ballot to make sure that there are no errant marks or that it's not damaged in any way, that it can actually be successfully tallied, and then it goes through the scanning process to be included in our tally process. Then there's also a process where you as a voter can track that vote by mail ballot. So as soon as you put it in a drop box or in the Postal Service, there's an ability for you to subscribe to receive text messages or email messages letting you know that we received your ballot, that the signature did match, and that it has gone through the tally process. So that empowers you as a voter to know that you haven't just put your voted ballot into this void and kind of have to rely on faith that that ballot has been processed correctly. So our vote by mail operation is a tremendous operation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. There we go. So that's the vote by mail process. But then, as I said, we have this in-person voting process that starts 10 days before the election. And that's really what catapulted us into the 21st century with reevaluating the logistics and the staffing procedures, so that instead of just having these random locations throughout the county, we're very intentional about where these locations are placed. In our study and research, we heard from voters who told us, many voters tell us that they think of voting and the significance of voting being in a public location. So a city hall, a public library, maybe a fire station. But there were other voters who told us that they actually don't want to vote in a city hall because the city hall is attached to a municipal police department, and they see that as a potential form of intimidation. Or they prefer to vote in a community center where they're amongst their neighbors or peers. The great thing about this model is we can offer both of those things. So voters can choose a location that is meaningful to them. And we'll open 648 locations in this election, about 120 of those 10 days before the election, and then the remainder opening the 4 days before November 5th. And this map, you can see the dots on that map represent the combination of our vote centers and our vote by mail drop boxes that are located throughout the county. So some details, kind of down in the weed details, but what does it require to be a vote center? We can't just set this up anywhere. It has to be a place that meets a number of different requirements. So we need a minimum of 1,400 square feet. We need a place that meets the accessibility standards, or at least allows us to mitigate to meet the accessibility standards to allow all voters to arrive. We need it to be available during the full voting period, so either for that 11-day period or for that 4-day period, and we need to be able to secure that. So it needs to be exclusively for voting. And there are some requirements for data and electrical capacity, and then they need to be geographically located in an equitable manner throughout the county. So that process of just identifying vote center placement and getting the agreements with our partners in the community is an enormous task in and of itself. I mentioned vote center accessibility. This is a fairly important one for us. So each of these places that we contract with to be vote centers, we have to go through what is usually an 8-hour assessment of the location where we're checking the very fine details about, are there door wedges that will make sure the doors are open? Is the path of travel from the parking lot into the voting area accessible to somebody in a wheelchair? Is there parking that's available for somebody who's in an accessible van or vehicle? So very critical details that are involved in that process. So we have a whole team that is constantly going out and assessing our facilities. And one of the things that I think sometimes surprises people is, despite the federal law and Americans with Disabilities Act, there are very few locations that are fully compliant with the ADA. And the Department of Justice, rightfully so, holds us to a higher standard for voting in that so we may use a public building that doesn't meet those requirements, but we have to make it accessible for voting because of the fundamental purpose of the electoral process. So that's a major priority for us. So then there's election worker recruitment. And for these 648 locations, we have to have close to 10,000 people who staff those locations during that voting period. And we do that through a combination of community election workers, high school student workers, and then we also are fortunate in LA County that we're able to recruit and utilize county employees from all county departments. So we really approach elections in LA County as a county-wide operation, not simply a function of the Registrar-Recorder County Clerk. And then they go through extensive training before deployment. So that's just, I could go into more detail about that, but I wanted to just paint the picture of that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in order to make this process work. And we depend on a lot of partners in order for it to work. But that's just the logistics and operations side of it. Then there's the voter engagement side. And one of the things we are very aware of is that there are a lot of things that contribute to whether people are motivated to cast a ballot. So sometimes people are highly motivated because they're interested in a candidate, interested in a position on a measure. But we also have people who are new to the voting process and who are intimidated by the process. We have people who maybe feel like the people that they've elected or the decisions they've made on measures have failed them, so they become cynical and jaded about the process. So our job as elections administrators is not to get into the political side of that, not to talk about candidates or to talk about ballot measures, but to talk about the importance of voting and to remind voters that it is one of those few places where in the act of voting, we all have an equal voice. And when you don't exercise that voice, you're actually giving more power to the other people who are participating in the elections. So we run a very active voter education and outreach campaign. We don't do that alone. We're a very large county, so we partner with community organizations, ethnic media, and social media influencers to provide information. We actually have, and just launched today, a digital toolkit that has social media posts, flyers, graphics, video clips that are just simple reminders of when will your ballot be in the mail? When will the vote centers open? What are the hours of voting? And in a presidential election, that's particularly critical because, as you may already be experiencing, what you're seeing in mainstream media today about the voting process is not about the voting process in California. It's about the voting processes in the swing states. So you're getting a lot of information about how voting works in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia. But that's not necessarily the way the voting process works in California. And that's not to say that their processes are bad. It's just that voting is a very localized state rights process. So our job is to make sure that voters in California and in Los Angeles County understand how the process works here, and to, in some cases, unfortunately many cases, to combat mis and disinformation about the voting process so that people feel comfortable about their voting process. So we do that through voter engagement tools. We do it through educational campaigns. You'll start to see some very micro-targeting on streaming media, outdoor advertisement, and that type of stuff. Again, just providing information about how voting works in LA County. But because we are so large and diverse, we have also adopted a philosophy in our voter outreach and education program to not just do generic advertisement and information, but to focus on where are those low propensity communities in our county? Where are the geographic areas that are traditionally not well represented in the voter turnout? Or what are the communities or demographics of people who are not often represented? So our advertisements and our outreach efforts are really targeted to those components. And I would say that this is probably the exception in this room, but it is voters who are between the ages of 18 and 29 that are the lowest proportionally represented in the turnout in national elections. Yet they are the largest block of voters in most jurisdictions in this country too, which means that voters between 18 and 29 have the largest opportunity to influence the outcome of our elections. So part of our messaging is trying to provide that information and to provide a voting experience that is relevant to that demographic. Side note that that's an interesting thing just from a public administration standpoint, because in Los Angeles County, the two fastest growing populations are that age group, 18 to 29, and those over the age of 65. So when you're designing public services and trying to find the best way to engage and meet people where they're at, those are very different dynamics. And so we're very cognizant of the need to address both of those. There we go. So another one that I think is just worth mentioning, because we're very, very proud of this in Los Angeles County, another form of outreach is we recognize there are populations that people often forget. And one of those is that we have a very large population of voters who are incarcerated in LA County that still have the right to vote. So people who are in county jails pending trial or for misdemeanor offenses, they have not lost their right to vote. They have the opportunity to vote in our elections. And so we have partnered with the LA County Sheriff, the LA County Probation Department, and the LA County Public Defender. For many years, we've done this through a vote-by-mail process where we allow inmates to request a vote-by-mail ballot. We prepare that, take that into the jails, and let them vote their ballots. But always prior to this last year, that has always required them to have to depend on a member of the jail staff to actually handle their ballot. This year, after piloting in 2 elections, we are now offering in-person vote centers at all of our jail facilities in LA County, which means we actually go in, set up a vote center, and those inmates who want to register and want to participate in the election are able to do that without having to rely on the support of somebody from the jail staff. It's been a very successful program, and we're excited about doing that again for this general election. So, again, that's a little bit about how we engage voters, a little bit about the mechanics and operations, a little bit about our philosophy in LA County. But now I want to talk a little more broadly about what's been the post-2020 landscape. You saw in the video that 2020 was a unique election because we were conducting that election in the face of a global pandemic. And the November election, it was literally a week after the primary election in March that LA County shut down for the pandemic. And then we had to very quickly pivot and figure out how were we going to conduct the November 2020 general election when there's this huge public health issue going on. I will say that we didn't know it at the time, but the fact that we had created this new model of voting that was in multiple locations and over multiple days was really a lifesaver for us, because we ended up having record voter turnout in 2020, and I think it would have been very challenging to try and do that under the previous model. But as you saw at the end of the video, and as you've experienced, as we've all experienced, the 2020 election has remained top-line news every day since the 2020 election. We are still talking about the 2020 election, whether it was legitimate, whether the outcome was correct, and there has been a literal attack on the mechanics of how elections are run, and people are being fed a lot of information that could easily make them cynical about the voting process. So that's changed the nature of the work that we do. It's created a new election narrative. We now, as election administrators, aren't just about those operational logistics that I talked about a few minutes ago. We now also have to be concerned about things like cybersecurity attacks and nation-state actors. So you're probably hearing just in the last week about concerns about information coming through artificial intelligence or through paid social media campaigns coming from Iran or from Russia that are seeking to influence either the outcome of the election in the United States or the voters' perceptions about the mechanics of voting. So we now have a 24/7 secure operations center that is monitoring web activity, monitoring our systems to make sure that there isn't disruption that would keep us from having a successful election. So that's kind of top line a change in our industry is having to become information security experts and to change the narrative. It used to be, Mike Sanchez is here, he's our communications manager in our office. It used to be in an elections office, a communications manager job was to put out press releases and to post legal notices. Now we're in a position where we have to proactively communicate what's happening in our office, because if we're not out there providing the real story about what's going on in our office, then we're going to be put in a defensive mode, trying to defend against dis and misinformation. So I'm going to skip that. I'm not going to go into the detail about our cybersecurity program. There's probably people in this room who could do a better job of explaining that than I can. Other than I do want to leave you with the confidence that we are monitoring that on a 24/7 basis, and we take it extremely seriously. But what are the other the new threat environment, things that in my history as an election administrator that we didn't used to have to deal with? I talked about misinformation and disinformation. These are examples that maybe you wouldn't think about, but this is an example under misinformation where 300 plus ballots in the gubernatorial recall election that took place were found by the Torrance Police Department. This is a headline that came out during the election, right? Looks bad, sounds bad. The reality is these were ballots that were mailed out. They went out from the U.S. Postal Service. Somebody who was involved in mail theft, who was took mail trays out of a U.S. Postal Service vehicle, sorted through them looking for credit cards and other information, and then discarded the ballots. But that's the type of headline that, given the rhetoric that's out there about the election process, that can create a perception of lack of security and lack of confidence in the elections process. So we have to be prepared to address that. The good news is we have cooperative relationships in a situation like this. There is another option for those voters. They can vote in person during the in-person voting period, but we also were able to get custody of these back from the Torrance Police Department and reissue ballots to all of those voters. Disinformation, this is the life of social media, where somebody posted that they just received their California voting information guide Only problem is they haven't lived in California for over 2 years, and they've lived in Tennessee for 2 years and basically said this is proof that there's fraud in the election. The reality is that voter was receiving a required piece of mail as a former resident of Los Angeles County that was seeking their confirmation of whether or not they lived in LA County. It wasn't a ballot, it was information that's used for list maintenance. So we now, in addition to being cybersecurity monitors, we also need to be social media monitors because, as you can see, this was retweeted 8,538 times and liked 41,000 times. So if we don't respond to that kind of misinformation, we're leaving a narrative out there that the election is insecure. Then there's artificial intelligence. We saw earlier this year the case in New Hampshire where a robocall was made using the voice of President Biden, but it really wasn't President Biden, and it was providing misinformation about the elections process too. So we have to be on top of our game. In addition to that, we have physical security concerns. Just this week, there were reports in 3 states, unfortunately, California is not one of them in this case, but that received mail at election offices with suspicious material in it, so powdery substances. And what that would mean what we're seeing is that that's sort of a denial of service attack, if you will, that people are doing that in order to try and cause operations like ours to shut down our operations and disrupt the elections process. So what we've done in our ballot processing center is we now deploy the LA County Sheriff's K-9 unit, drug K-9 unit, and every day when our vote-by-mail ballots come in, whether it's from our drop boxes or from the U.S. Postal Service, the first scan is for the K-9 dogs to check those trays. So if there is a piece of suspicious mail, we can isolate that, but we don't shut down our entire operations. So these are the kind of things we're dealing with. And unfortunately, throughout the country, there's now an issue of threats to election workers. I had colleagues in the post-2020 election period who had to relocate their families because they were subject to threats and harassment based on the rhetoric about how elections are conducted. So positions like mine, at one time, were sort of obscure. We sort of worked in the background and made this stuff happen. Now we're sort of on the front lines of that. But we're not deterred. We believe in what we're doing, and we're not going to let that prevent us. And I will say, I think it's important to say that this is not just one party. I think it's extremists on either side. I had demonstrators come to my residence in the 2020 election, and they were on the far left of the spectrum. But the interesting thing is that they were using the same narrative, the same rhetoric that was being heard through the Stop the Steal effort that you saw happening in other states across the country. So it's an interesting environment to work in, but it also is a reminder of how critical it is that we don't allow that to chip away at the foundation of the process that actually guarantees that we have a representative form of government in the United States. So fast forward to 2024. We have this year, in response to that new threat environment, we opened a state-of-the-art ballot processing center in the City of Industry. I came from there today. It used to be that our process was decentralized, that if you wanted to observe the tallying of the ballots, if you wanted to observe the processing of vote-by-mail ballots or the canvass of the election, those were all in different locations throughout the county, and we had to actually move the ballots from one location to another. We now do that all under one roof, and we designed that facility for optimum transparency and optimum security. So it's got 24/7 security, it's got cameras, and the cameras are not just for security, the cameras are also live streamed. So if you are questioning whether or not ballots are being handled securely in LA County, you can actually watch that process from the comfort of your home. Not the most exciting video, but it does provide some canvas or for some confidence. It's also where we canvass after the election. And after the election, we conduct a 1% manual audit. A lot of people don't realize this, but after we tally the ballots on our voting system, then in the weeks after the election, we do a random sampling of 1% of those ballots, and we manually count those and compare the counts to our tally system to demonstrate the efficacy of the tally equipment. And I'm very proud to say that on our VSAP tally system, we have had no variances in that manual count since we implemented that system back in 2020. And I talked about the K-9 unit. I will invite you all, if you're interested. It is meant to be a public space, and it is meant to demonstrate that the voting process belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to my department. It belongs to the voters of LA County. And so in about 2 weeks, that place is going to be buzzing every day leading up to the election for the 29 days heading into the election. If you're interested in coming and having a tour and observing that process, you're more than welcome to do that. Or you can look online, but it's not as exciting online. So just some statistics to share before I wrap up. This gives you a snapshot of what happened in this year, the March primary this year. So you heard in the video about some of the challenges we faced in the 2020 primary. The 2024 primary was very different. We now have about 80% of our voters voting by mail and 20% voting in person. I talked about the various models of voting, and you can see the statistics there. As a result of that, we had about 41% of our voters who voted by mail return their ballots through the U.S. Postal Service, 44% through our drop boxes. This is an interesting one because there's a lot of talk about vote by mail drop boxes nationally, but our voters here locally, that is the preferred method of returning their ballot. And then 15% of the voters return their ballots in person at a vote center. This just gives you an example of how things have changed since June of 2008 through March of 2024. You can see that the trend of using vote by mail has gone up significantly in the county as opposed to in-person voting. This is one that we're interested in watching to see what happens, because generally in a presidential general election, turnout goes up significantly, and we do expect a higher number of people to vote in person during a presidential election than we typically would see in other elections. And this is another one, this is again getting kind of down in the weeds, but I think worth noting that the other thing that we see is the trend of when people vote and when they return those ballots is much later in the process. So people who return their vote by mail ballots at a vote center on election night, that ballot still has to go through the signature verification process and all the same security as the vote by mail ballots that were voted early in the process. What that means is on election night, we face that we're likely to receive as many as 800,000 to 1 million ballots that are turned in on election day, either through drop boxes, the mail, or at vote centers, which means that the results we release on election night are not going to be final results. We still are going to have possibly half of the votes to be cast in this election that are still to be processed and counted during the days after the election. This is one that gets a lot of attention in the national news too, because California has very broad rights for voters to allow them the greatest opportunity to cast their ballot, and that means that we still have a lot of ballots to count after Election Day. There are other states that certify their election within 1 week of the election. We certify our election 29 days after the election. So just to put that in perspective and kind of the dynamic that creates is in the last election for mayor of Los Angeles on election night, when we finally finished on election night, the Mayor Karen Bass and Mr. Caruso, who were the candidates in that election, were basically in a 50-50 almost tie. By the time we certified that election, Mayor Bass won the election, I think, by 52 or 53%. And so that shows you that the trend of what's happening in the election varies the further you go into the election. But that, of course, invites a lot of conspiracy about, I've been accused of figuring out how many more ballots we need to count in order to have a particular outcome, for instance. So it's an interesting dynamic, but behind that is a philosophy in California to give every voter the greatest opportunity to cast their ballot. And I believe that is appropriate. So again, in March primary, we counted 703,000 ballots after Election Day before we certified that election. So we do expect that in November, that there's going to be a significant amount of ballots that are still coming in late on Election Day. We are trying to adjust our process so that we can keep updating those on a daily basis to give voters confidence about the process, but it will be significant in this election. And again, I think I already went through these dates. We are literally a day before the first ballots going in the mail, so voting will start in Los Angeles County as early as this weekend, and we will be right in the thick of it here in the days and weeks ahead. So I wanted to give you that just from the perspective of kind of what happens behind the scenes and give you a perspective of what operationally is involved in the election and what these overtones and these new threat vectors, the impact they have on the process, but also to hopefully give you the confidence that we take that very seriously and that we are monitoring that, and we are always looking for ways to adapt our voting model and our services to meet those threats. And that is really the kind of the best part of the Voting Solutions for All People project, is that it was built on a platform so that we can adjust. We don't know if we're going to face a pandemic. We don't know if in the next few weeks, if we're going to face situations where there are, the possibility of demonstrations in downtown LA during that 10-day voting period that maybe don't even have to do with elections, but they could potentially disrupt the ability of people to get to a voting location. Those are the kind of situations that we are heads down doing tabletop exercises and making sure we're prepared so that we can respond and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to vote in this upcoming election. I don't want to leave you with a cynical view on that. It is a challenging job, but it's also a very satisfying job. I can think of a few other things that I could do professionally where I could see on a day-to-day basis the difference that we're making. And I'll just share an anecdotal story before I make my final concluding remarks. One of the things that was really important to me when we started on the Voting Solutions for All People project, I mentioned that we wanted to get away from that check the box mentality, and in particular, wanted to make sure that voting accessibility was a priority for us. So we went early on in the design phase of the project to the Cerebral Palsy Center of Los Angeles and met with a series of about a dozen voters who were so inspirational to me. They were people with severe physical disabilities and very diverse physical disabilities that they told us, they basically told us in that focus group, these were adults who had been civically engaged, civically interested in public policy and public elections their entire adult life, but one of them had never been able to vote a secret ballot without the assistance of a caregiver or a family member. And we listened to them, and we looked at the way they interacted with other things in their day-to-day lives, and we incorporated that into the design of our ballot marking device. And then we took back a prototype of that voting device to that same center, to those same 12 voters. And we stepped back and gave them a ballot and watched as each one of them were able to vote independently without the assistance of another voter. And it was an amazing experience to see that. And I think that's what we mean. That's why we call this Voting Solutions for All People, is that we want a customizable voting experience that allows every eligible voter to be able to cast a ballot without assistance. And we don't want them to have to be treated differently in that process. So every one of our voting devices in our vote centers provides that capability. You don't have to ask for special assistance for that. You can all benefit from those features. So I'm going to conclude because I'm really interested in your questions and having a dialogue with you, but I thought it was important, as you heard in my bio, I do teach organizational leadership and public sector management part-time at Cal State Northridge. People think I'm crazy. They say, isn't your full-time job busy enough? It is. I don't have a lot of extra time, but I do that because, quite frankly, the mid-career people that are in those programs are a microcosm of the people that work in my organization. So it keeps me on my toes. It keeps me familiar with what are the challenges that people face and reminds me of the importance of staying cognizant of that. So I just wanted to share with you that when I reflect back on, hopefully you saw in the video, there were some challenging times in this project. There were times where, quite frankly, it would have been easier to throw in the towel and just to say that I don't want to deal with this anymore. I went through the very painful experience at times of leading an organization that was unable to meet the very real expectations of the public we serve, and that's part of public administration. So you can either run from that or you can figure out how to make it better. And so I just wanted to share with you that when I reflect back on that, what are the lessons learned from that? And so I'll just leave you with this, that out of that experience which was a decade-long project, I now believe in this kind of 8 steps of change management and transformational leadership. And these are ones that resonate for me. One is to confront the brutal facts of your current reality. That's really what started the Voting Solutions for All People project, is that we knew if we didn't do something that we weren't going to be able to meet our basic requirements of providing elections. And so instead of giving into that, we said, let's turn that around, make it an opportunity, and let's throw out all the barriers to the process and say, we're going to do this as a grassroots project and come up with something that works for all of us. We were fortunate in that LA County, because of the uniqueness of LA County, we were able to do that, and we were able to get the patience of our authorizing environment to stick with us through that project. Second one is ask audacious questions. That's what we did. The first thing, we started this whole project simply by asking, what would it be like to create a voting model that provided a positive voting experience for all voters? We just had that open question, and that led to the design that you're hearing me talk about tonight. Third, you've already heard me say this, is meet them where they are. Meet people where they're at. If they're cynical about voting, then meet them with their cynicism. If they're a lifelong voter who is a champion of voting, then let's make sure we are providing an experience that lives up to that as well. Fourth, listen and observe. The benefit that we had from just simply talking to voters, talking to the next generation of voters coming forward, and also sitting back and watching people was a key part of the design of this process, because sometimes, this may shock you, sometimes what people tell you is not exactly the way they act. Right? So when we had user testing and we watched people interacting with the prototypes of our voting equipment, we learned things that were different from what they were telling us that they wanted from the voting experience. And some of them, by the way, we often overthink those things. Some of them were easy things to address. Like the first time we did a user test, we had all of our voting devices on the periphery of the room. So people, when they went to vote, they were facing towards the wall. And what we heard is that they didn't feel a sense of privacy in that. They felt like somebody was watching them, and it was an intimidating process. That was an easy fix. So if you go to our vote centers today, you'll see that our voting devices face into the room so that when you're in the voting booth, you don't have that sense of people standing behind you and the possible intimidation. Fifth, build capacity. Don't undertake projects of this magnitude by yourself. It takes a community of people. You need stakeholders. You need people. You heard in the video, we brought to the table people who were critical of our operations, people who were cynical about even our commitment to the work that we were doing. And we wanted them there because we knew at some point in the project we were going to have to make choices and compromises. And we knew that we needed them to be champions of the end of our project too. So we needed them to understand where we had to make those decisions. Next, trust the process. There are times where it's just discouraging and you just don't know if it's ever going to be worth it. But if you trust the process, trust the principles that you put in at the beginning, they will see you through. Seventh, celebrate incremental success. And for me, that goes back to the story of the voters at the Cerebral Palsy Center of Los Angeles. Because I will tell you, had we not successfully implemented this process and had successful elections, that experience alone would have been worth it for me. And sometimes you don't get to the finish line when you're innovative and when you're taking risks, but it's still worth celebrating those incremental successes because they're going to lead you on a path that's going to get to something greater. And finally, embrace the fear and move forward. There were always more reasons not to do this than there were reasons to do it. And sometimes you just have to plunge into it and say, we don't know what the end result is going to look like. We don't know what the solution is. And we certainly didn't know the solution when we started this project, but we knew that a solution was needed and we needed to take the steps to get there. And that is what led us here. And it was a whole bunch of people who really dug in and stuck with this that made it happen. And as a result, the voting process in LA County is better. It's not a finished product. There will always be more work to do, and we're continuing to look at what needs to happen next, and that's why interchanges like this and watching what happens here in 47 days is going to be important. But I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit with you tonight about that process. I hope you will all encourage others to vote. If you vote in LA County and you have observations or ideas, please share those with us. And if you're interested in coming and watching any part of the process, if this has inspired you in any way tonight, please be in touch with us. We would love to have you. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your time and insights. We're now moving on to the Q&A portion of tonight's session. That being said, just in the interest of time, we might be only able to take 1 or 2 questions. Please state your name, your year, and your school. And if you want to, you can also add in your major. But please keep your questions brief and also no follow-up questions. Thank you.
Hi again. I'm Deborah. I'm a freshman here at CMC. So unfortunately, I won't be voting in LA County. I'll be voting in San Bernardino County, so I won't get to use the cool machines. But I was just wondering, I was kind of curious, have there been this type of initiatives other places in the country? And if not, do you think there's a future where this level of accessibility would be available to people either throughout California or in other states?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. So there have been a couple other initiatives similar to this. In terms of the public ownership of the voting process and some projects related to open source voting equipment. I think that our project is from a voting perspective, I think is the only one that is kind of holistically looked at the voting experience as a whole. But to the latter part of your question, we're very excited about the fact that, again, as you heard me talk about, we're a very unique jurisdiction. So not every jurisdiction needs what we need in LA County. So we intentionally built the VSAP model in a module basis so that parts of it could be taken and used elsewhere. And because it's publicly owned, we can share it with other jurisdictions. And so we're very excited that there is some interest, in particular, in the accessible voting equipment that we're looking at. So I do think in early 2025 that there are some other jurisdictions that'll be looking at possibly adopting that part of the project.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the slides kind of spoke about like all the restrictions to be eligible as a voting center, like the size and internet access and accessibility. And like I understand the intent there, but like don't some requirements like internet speed mean that rural communities or like poor communities might not have as many eligible centers, and wouldn't that like cause another accessibility issue?
No, thank you for the question. And I think that's a question of equity that we take very seriously. And so while those requirements exist, we also have solutions that address portions of that. So for instance, we use Starlight satellites. So if there isn't connectivity in a particular area, in a rural area or an underserved area, we can still set up a vote center there. But where I want to go with your question is something that more recently happened, and that is what I talked about in terms of compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is we face this very interesting dilemma where the Department of Justice was saying, well, look, we've come into your community and we've visited some of these vote centers, and they have barriers to accessibilities, and there were very specific barriers, like the sidewalk, the slope of the sidewalk coming from a public transit station was too high and didn't meet the requirements of the ADA. That's an interesting challenge for us, because I, as an election official, can solve a lot of issues. I can put in door stops. I can put in temporary parking signs. I can't fix sidewalks, right? So that's something that requires a more collaborative agreement with municipalities or other governments. But I think it raises an issue. It raises the issue you brought up, and we had this conversation with the Department of Justice, is that if you're going to enforce those standards and say we can't open vote centers in those communities, those are also the communities that have received the least amount of federal infrastructure dollars to allow them to upgrade their facilities to meet the ADA. So it is one of those things where the intentions of policy sometimes conflict, right? And so we are fighting to make sure that we can still have places. And we know, for instance, in the Watts area of LA, we know from those voters, they've told us they're not going to leave that area to go vote somewhere else, even though they could. But we also know that the community center where they have asked us to host voting has some serious accessibility issues. So when I say the work is not yet done, that's a good example of we still have work to do to make sure that not just for voting, but for all public services, that those facilities are upgraded and accessible.
Hi, I'm Inona. I'm a senior psychology major at Pitzer. I guess my question's a bit more philosophical, but how do you feel like a job in your position or a similar career allows or does not allow for a balance between your work and then your personal beliefs in politics? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, I think, a very personalized situation. I got my interest. I mean, what kind of led me to this was through being involved politically in campaigns and activities. I also, at one point in my career, ran for public office and served in public office, and so I have a history, and I'm an active voter, and I have a political viewpoint. But I think when you're doing this work, you have to set that aside, and you have to do it in a way that that allows for all viewpoints to be held. And so what I could tell you is that there's been a lot of talk about that since 2020 in the field of elections administration. Some have argued that, for instance, that maybe they should regulate election administration and say we can't be registered with a political party or something of that nature. I actually believe that what's more important is that we have transparency and chain of custody and checks and balances, so it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter what party I am. I should be able to demonstrate the efficacy of the elections process, and if I can do that and provide those services in an equitable manner, then it shouldn't matter what political party I'm associated with. So, but it also varies all over the country. In some many states, actually, people in my position are locally elected officials and they're partisan elected officials, and so they face that dilemma of being held accountable for the process, but also having to defend their own personal political views.
Thank you.
Awesome. With that, we are going to elapse the Q&A session. I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for your insight, and being such a steadfast person who upholds our democracy in the most valuable way that we can be a democracy. So thank you so much for your service to the LA County. We really appreciate it. And with that, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much.